In February 1942, while the Red Army was still bleeding around Rzhev and Sevastopol, a different kind of threat was taking shape hundreds of kilometers away on the Baltic coast. On the maps in Moscow, the bay near Peenemünde looked like just another German naval area, but buried in German budget lines and construction orders was something else, an army research centre that was suddenly consuming funds, concrete, and the brightest engineers from firms like Junkers and Siemens. At the same moment, British photo interpreters were arguing over strange structures on Usedom Island, and Swedish observers were filing reports about vertical flashes over the Baltic that did not match any known aircraft. The OKH and SS signed off on new security zones there without explanation. No one outside a tiny inner circle was told that Walter Dornberger and Werner von Braun had been given a mandate to build a weapon that would reach beyond conventional artillery, beyond fighters and bombers, into a new domain of warfare. Soviet intelligence officers based in Germany began to notice those anomalies. One of them, working under deep cover, watched the flow of material with growing unease. This agent, later codenamed in Soviet files as a specialist on industrial reporting, saw requisitions for massive compressors, unusual guidance instruments, telemetry receivers, and bulk deliveries of liquid oxygen and alcohol. None of it fitted the profile of a new fighter or bomber. It suggested a propulsion system that did not belong to conventional aircraft at all. Meanwhile, reports filtered in from neutral observers along the Swedish coast. They described strange, luminous traces reaching high into the night, then fading without the usual sound of an aircraft overhead. Even German soldiers assigned to Usedom were warned not to ask questions about the test range. The phrase Peenemünde appeared only in restricted correspondence, buried under layers of code numbers and misleading project names. The Soviet agent pieced these fragments together in a cramped safe house, working by lamplight over intercepted memos and copied invoices. The more he saw, the more one conclusion forced itself onto the page. Somewhere on that Baltic island, Germany was developing a weapon that required an extraordinary level of secrecy and power. He forwarded his findings through established channels, hoping that in Moscow someone would recognize the danger. The report joined a stack of competing alarms arriving from every front. No immediate orders came back. While the Soviet Union focused on survival at Stalingrad and rebuilding its shattered armies, Peenemünde was left to continue its work in relative silence. And in that silence, Germany's secret weapon continued to take shape. The Soviet agent assigned to watch German industry did not begin his career as a specialist in secret weapons. Operating in Berlin as part of a small residentura cell, his main task was to follow aircraft production, which factories expanded, which contracts grew, which models the Luftwaffe prioritized. In a war where air superiority could decide entire campaigns, those statistics mattered. Yet, time after time, a single destination kept reappearing in transfer orders and personnel lists, even when no aircraft project was involved. It was usually written in shorthand or misspelled deliberately. Peenem, Peen, or simply as a numeric code. Engineers from firms like Junkers and Heinkel quietly disappeared from their regular posts and reappeared under army control, assigned to this remote facility on the Baltic coast. Rail shipments left central Germany under Luftwaffe documentation and arrived bearing Army and Navy handling codes. Some wagons carried liquid oxygen tanks, others specialized steels, others precision gyroscopes normally reserved for naval gunnery. Each item could be explained away on its own. Together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. The agent, known in Soviet records under the alias Markovsky, began to treat Peenemünde as a separate target. He cultivated contacts among technicians, suppliers, and clerks who handled paperwork for the new base. He never asked about rockets directly. Instead, he inquired about components, pumps that could withstand extreme pressure, tanks for super-cold liquids, instruments calibrated for rapid changes in attitude. The answers came slowly, through fragments and casual remarks. By mid-1943, those fragments could be assembled into something more concrete. Markovsky had obtained technical sketches showing elongated bodies, with conical forward sections and large combustion chambers, nothing like any existing aircraft engine. He heard references to test stands, vertical firing, and ranges that stretched far beyond artillery. To preserve this evidence, he photographed the documents on miniature cameras and transferred the film onto narrow strips concealed in ordinary objects. When that microfilm reached Soviet intelligence analysts, the reaction was cautious. Germany was on the back foot at Stalingrad and in North Africa. Many in Moscow believed the Reich lacked the time and resources for revolutionary new weapons. The idea of a large rocket capable of delivering a warhead hundreds of kilometers still seemed closer to theory than to immediate military reality. Markovsky, however, persisted. He returned to supply depots, copied rail manifests, and used every available channel to collect additional material. In a stroke of luck, he secured partial blueprints for an unfamiliar propulsion assembly, clearly designed for vertical thrust rather than horizontal flight. Those images were added to a new microfilm packet and dispatched to Moscow in July 1943. As the packet moved eastward by clandestine routes, another development was already underway over the Baltic. The British had drawn their own conclusions about Peenemünde and were preparing a very different kind of investigation, one carried out not by spies and cameras but by bomber formations. If you're enjoying this story, hit like, share it with someone who also loves hidden chapters of history, and subscribe for more hidden stories of World War II. And after you finish the documentary, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your take. A sudden flash lit the sky above Peenemünde. For a moment it looked as if dawn had arrived early over the Baltic, though the clock still stood close to midnight. Then the sound followed, rolling in waves, shaking windows and rattling fittings across the island. The Royal Air Force had come. On the night of 17th to 18, August 1943, more than 560 bombers from RAF Bomber Command crossed the Baltic coast under cover of darkness. It was Operation Hydra, the opening blow in what the British hoped would be a decisive strike against Germany's new secret weapon. Intelligence from resistance networks, aerial reconnaissance and intercepted communications had convinced Allied planners that Peenemünde was at the heart of a revolutionary program. If the site could be smashed before full-scale production began, a future threat to London might be averted. As the bomber stream approached, German radar operators raised the alarm. Searchlights swept the sky, anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, and air raid sirens wailed across nearby towns. Moments later, high explosive and incendiary bombs began to fall on the research centre and the adjacent housing for workers and forced labourers. Workshops burned, test stands were damaged, roads and rail lines were torn apart. For those on the ground, the night became a chaotic mix of smoke, fire and confusion. News of the raid reached Allied and Soviet intelligence services almost immediately. For the Soviet side, the British attack brought both confirmation and complication. Microfilm packets from Berlin were still being processed in Moscow, and analysts had only just begun to grasp the scale of the program at Peenemünde. Now, their assessments arrived alongside Allied reports describing rocket establishments, pilotless aircraft, and long-range bombardment devices. The terminology differed, but the implication was the same. Germany was working on weapons that did not require pilots and could reach distant cities. For Markovsky, learning of the raid was a bitter vindication. The place he had highlighted repeatedly was suddenly at the centre of an international bombing operation, yet the destruction that the RAF inflicted also had an unintended effect. Laboratories, test rigs and living quarters were hit unevenly. Some key personnel died, others survived and were relocated inland. Physical evidence that might have clarified the weapon's exact capabilities was destroyed, scattered or moved. In Moscow, analysts tried to reconstruct the picture from damaged reports and overlapping sources. The raid confirmed that Peenemünde housed a major research effort, and it reinforced the idea that Germany was pursuing a rocket or pilotless bomb. But it also meant that the facility would not remain static. Whatever survived would be moved, protected and accelerated. The question shifted from whether Germany was building such a weapon to how soon it might be ready and where it would be hidden next. As the smoke cleared over Euston and British crews debriefed back in England, the work at Peenemünde did not end. It changed shape, and in that transformation, the threat became harder to track than ever before. Months before anyone could agree on what the Germans were building, the first prototypes had already risen from the ground. Test launches of what would become the V-2 had begun at Peenemünde as early as 1942, with spectacular failures and gradual improvements. By late 1943, after the damage from Operation Hydra, the program was entering a new phase. The research centre on Usedom would remain important for testing, but mass production and long-term security required a different environment. Under orders from the Army High Command, large parts of the rocket program were dispersed. Engineers and equipment were transferred to underground facilities and remote valleys. The most significant move was to the Mittelwerk complex in the Harz Mountains, where tunnels originally intended for an aircraft plant were converted into a vast underground rocket factory. Here, shielded by rock and guarded by the SES, Germany's ballistic missile program gained a hardened core. From his position in Berlin, Markowski saw these changes not through maps, but through paperwork. Shipment destinations shifted from Peenemünde to locations near Nordhausen and Zangerhausen. Orders for alcohol fuel and liquid oxygen increased. Requests for precision guidance systems, servo motors and gyroscopes multiplied. The scale suggested a weapon no longer confined to experimental status, but moving towards series production. Meanwhile, other intelligence streams filled in more detail. A separate agent managed to obtain excerpts from test logs that described the aggregate 4, designated A4. The data listed maximum altitudes, flight times, and ranges that far exceeded heavy artillery. Soviet analysts compared those numbers with Markowski's earlier microfilm of the rocket's basic shape and engine layout. Piece by piece, the profile of a long-range ballistic missile emerged, a weapon launched vertically, leaving the atmosphere before arcing back toward its target at supersonic speed. The tragedy lay in the timing. Germany's desperation in the face of mounting defeats pushed the program forward at a relentless pace. Scientists and engineers were told that their work might provide a strategic miracle, a way to strike at enemy capitals even as the Wehrmacht retreated. Production schedules tightened, testing was intensified, failures were catalogued and corrected quickly, often at a terrible cost to the forced labourers who built the components. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was fighting major offensives at Kursk, Smolensk and beyond. Strategic attention was fixed on tanks, artillery and ground logistics, not on a remote research project that still appeared, on paper, to be a wide technical gamble. By the time Soviet intelligence fully accepted that the A4 was real and nearing readiness, reports from the West began to mention something else: unexplained explosions in or near cities, with no aircraft observed overhead. The weapon that had once existed only as suspicious shipments and blurry blueprints was about to demonstrate its reality not in laboratories, but in the streets of Europe. When the first V-2 struck London, no air raid siren sounded, because no one heard the missile coming. On 8th of September 1944, residents of the Chiswick district experienced what witnesses later described as a sudden, violent crack, as if the ground itself had fractured. An instant later, a blast tore through houses and streets, killing and injuring civilians who had no warning and no chance to reach shelters. For those on the receiving end, there was no visible attacker, only destruction that seemed to arrive out of a clear sky. The weapon responsible was the matured form of the A4 rocket, now designated Vergeltungswaffe II, or V2. It was launched from mobile sites in occupied Europe, rose beyond the speed of sound, and descended in a steep ballistic trajectory. Conventional air defences designed to detect aircraft engines and formations were effectively useless. Radar could follow the missile's arc, but only after launch. There was no practical way to intercept it before impact. Germany had introduced a new category of threat, a long-range projectile that turned distance and altitude into protection. For Markowski, news of the V2 attacks was confirmation of his darkest assessments. The system he had traced through invoices, sketches and whispered descriptions had become operational. The intelligence he had tried to push up the chain earlier was now reflected not in reports, but in casualty lists. Within Soviet institutions, reactions were mixed. Some saw in the weapon proof that Germany still possessed technical initiative despite battlefield defeats. Others argued that, for all its novelty, the V2 consumed enormous resources for limited military gain. Yet psychological effects mattered. The missiles struck London, Antwerp and other targets, creating uncertainty and fear. Defenders could not guarantee protection, and each explosion hinted at the possibility of further improvement. Greater range, better accuracy, heavier warheads. The rocket became a symbol of how quickly warfare could evolve beyond existing defences. On the Eastern Front, Soviet troops pressing westward began to encounter traces of the program on the ground. They overran training areas and launch zones that had been hastily evacuated. What they found were burnt concrete pads, abandoned fuel equipment, scattered fragments of wrecked missiles, and technical manuals too damaged to provide a complete picture. Much of what had been crucial was removed or destroyed. The conclusion emerged slowly. Soviet intelligence had been correct about the existence and general nature of the weapon, but the recognition had come too late to shape strategy before its deployment. No countermeasure was ready when the first V2 rose from its launch table. The war was entering its final phase, and this new technology was arriving as a preview of what future conflicts might bring. Even so, the missiles raining down on cities were only the visible surface of the program. The full scale of what Germany had built, and the human cost buried within it, would only become clear when the advancing armies reached the mountains of central Germany. The deeper Soviet troops pushed into Germany, the stranger some of the captured facilities became, until they reached a place that did not look like an ordinary factory at all. By early 1945, advancing Red Army formations entered central Germany and heard persistent rumours from forced labourers and civilians about an underground installation of unusual size in the Harz Mountains. There, according to frightened accounts, prisoners worked under brutal conditions on weapons, assembled in tunnels rather than surface plants. Following rail spurs and damaged supply lines, Soviet forces converged on the region around Nordhausen. Hidden in the Kohnstein mountain was Mittelwerk, the underground complex where V2 missiles had been produced. The tunnels had originally been carved for an aircraft project, but after the bombing of Peenemünde they were adapted for rocket manufacture. Long galleries contained assembly lines, side chambers held storage, machinery and test stands. The facility was built to keep production running even under bombardment. When Soviet engineers and officers inspected such sites and comparable remnants, the scale of the undertaking became clearer. They found jigs and fixtures shaped for the V2's fuselage, racks for guidance systems and equipment for handling liquid fuels. The remains of partially completed rockets lay in some areas, while in others only scattered parts and abandoned tools hinted at a hurried evacuation. Blueprints, test reports, and production lists had been left behind in varying states of order and destruction. The documents were revealing. Technical drawings marked A4, detailed engine layouts, turbopumps, and control arrangements. Production tables listed serial numbers and output targets running into the thousands. Research papers described potential improvements, winged variants, high-altitude boosters, and early concepts for multi-stage designs. For Soviet analysts, accustomed to thinking of the rocket as a single weapon, it became evident that Peenemünde and Mittelwerk had hosted an entire family of ideas. Alongside this technical trove was a stark human ledger. Mittelwerk and associated camps, including Dora, had consumed tens of thousands of forced labourers. Many had died from malnutrition, disease, accidents, or executions. Surviving prisoners spoke of incessant work, poor ventilation, and deadly risks in handling volatile fuels. The rockets that reached London and other targets were only the end products of a system that expended human lives as readily as raw materials. For Markovsky, receiving reports from these captured sites was both vindication and condemnation. The industrial ecosystem he had inferred from paperwork was now visible, accompanied by proof of the human cost that had been hidden from his earlier calculations. Germany had been ahead in rocket technology, and it had paid for that lead with underground factories and extreme brutality toward its labour force. As Soviet officers ordered machinery and documents shipped east, a difficult question lingered. If the intelligence about Peenemünde and its rockets had been accepted earlier, could any part of this network have been disrupted? Or was the logic of total war always going to drive the project forward regardless of warnings? By the time one war ended, another had silently begun, the race to claim Germany's rocket scientists and technology. As the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, front lines were no longer the only boundaries that mattered. Zones of occupation, advancing spearheads, and sudden local offensives were often driven as much by intelligence about specific facilities and personnel as by classic strategic objectives. Rockets, once regarded as experimental curiosities, were now recognized as tools that could shape the military balance of the future. American forces moved quickly. Under programs later consolidated under the name Operation Paperclip, US intelligence teams sought out Werner von Braun and key members of his Peenemünde staff. Many surrendered to American units in Bavaria, calculating that cooperation with the Western Allies offered better prospects than falling into Soviet hands. At the same time, British teams scoured Peenemünde and other sites, collecting hardware, documents, and remaining experts for their own investigations into guided weapons. The Soviet Union, arriving in some areas later, concentrated on what still lay within its advancing reach. Soviet specialists examined Peenemunde's surviving test stands, noting craters, damaged structures, and sections that had been dismantled before the Germans withdrew. They oversaw the loading of V2 components, fuel equipment, and measuring instruments onto trains bound for research centres in the Soviet interior. Technicians who had worked at Mittelwerk and associated facilities were interrogated, and in some cases, relocated eastward. From Markovsky's vantage point inside the intelligence apparatus, the irony was hard to ignore. The blueprints and reports he had struggled to have taken seriously were now treated as valuable assets, not warnings. The same characteristics that had once made the V2 seem implausible, a combination of advanced materials, complex guidance, and high-altitude flight, now made it an irresistible foundation for post-war research. What had been considered a costly terror, weapon during the war became, almost overnight, a prototype for future missile and space programs. Within a few years, Soviet engineers would adapt V2 technology into the R-1 rocket and use the experience gained to design more capable systems. American teams performed similar work at White Sands and other test ranges. The shattered infrastructure of Peenemünde and Mittelwerk thus fed directly into a new era of competition between former allies. The rocket, born as a German instrument of retaliation, became an international object of study and ambition. For the individuals who had served inside wartime intelligence, this transformation raised unsettling questions. Their role had once been to prevent surprises, to detect and expose dangerous developments before they could alter the battlefield. Now, the same discoveries were being used not to block a threat, but to ensure that their own states would not fall behind in the next stage of technological rivalry. As the immediate wreckage of war was cleared away and new laboratories took shape, it was clear that the story of Peenemünde had not ended with the last wartime launch. It had merely changed arenas. When the war finally ended, Markovsky returned to the Soviet Union under a new identity, his work buried inside classified archives. Official histories would later refer to intelligence reports on German special weapons in general terms without listing the names of the agents who had compiled them. The men and women who had risked their lives in safe houses, rail yards, and factory offices became footnotes in closed files. Among them was the officer who had first traced the arc from obscure procurement orders to the rocket trails over the Baltic. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union devoted substantial resources to its own missile and space programs. Test ranges were established, design bureaus formed, and rival teams assembled around competing concepts. Engineers pored over captured German documents, incorporating some ideas directly and discarding others as impractical. As new rockets rose from Soviet test stands, veterans of the wartime intelligence services noticed familiar patterns in engine schematics and guidance diagrams. The shapes and numbers they had once seen on clandestine microfilm now appeared on official blueprints. For Markovsky, observing this transformation from within the system was a complex experience. On one hand, he understood the strategic necessity. In a world where potential adversaries were developing similar technologies, refusing to build rockets would not prevent their use. It would only leave the country vulnerable. On the other hand, he could not forget that his original intention had been to warn of danger, not to lay the groundwork for a new generation of powerful weapons. Occasionally, during internal discussions about long-range missiles or satellite launches, someone would mention Peenemünde and the V2 as historical reference points. The conversation would move on quickly, focused on present challenges. For most of the people in the room, those names were milestones in technical development, rather than reminders of missed chances. Only a few connected them to the years when reports from Berlin and Sweden had competed for attention, with urgent news from the Eastern Front. In private moments, he sometimes considered how history might have unfolded if his reports had been heeded earlier, if more weight had been given to the anomalies he'd flagged. Perhaps different bombing priorities would have been set, or different diplomatic pressures applied. Perhaps little would have changed at all. Wars involve so many moving parts that even accurate warnings can struggle to find practical expression. What remained, in the end, was a lesson about timing and attention. Intelligence can reveal what is being built and even why, but it cannot guarantee when leaders will act on it. The blueprints Markovsky had once hidden in the seams of ordinary objects outlived the war that had given them urgency. They became part of a longer story in which the line between warning and opportunity was rarely clear, and in which the echoes of a missed alarm continued to shape decisions long after the guns had fallen silent.